14 minutes after 2 o'clock, and it is time for Legal Talk. And today we welcome back Nicolene Schoeman-Louw, who's an attorney and the managing director of SchoemanLaw Inc. And as it's wedding season and we're seeing more and more South Africans getting married and getting married to foreigners, we thought we'd ask Nicolene to unpack the difference between local unions marrying a foreign national and when two foreigners have the destination wedding of their dreams here in South Africa. Good afternoon, Nicolene. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's start at the very beginning with the basics. What do you need to do to register a marriage between two South Africans? What documents are required?
Well, from a legal perspective, if the couple wishes to be married outside of the regime of being married in community of property, they would need to conclude an antenuptial contract before the ceremony and the marriage is officiated. So from a legal point of view, that's the first document that would be required. The marriage officer is either someone affiliated to a religious denomination or maybe independent, would then conduct the actual ceremony and complete the required documents for submission to Home Affairs. This may require fingerprints being taken. The relevant forms would be signed as published by the Department of Home Affairs, and the ID documents are usually also submitted as proof of the identity of the parties. So in a nutshell, those would be the most elementary requirements in order to conclude a marriage within South Africa.
Okay, and then things obviously get a little bit more complicated when you start bringing a foreign person into the mix. So if a South African marries a foreigner, then what documents are required?
Well, the basics, as just mentioned, would still apply with one additional requirement, and that would obviously be for the foreign national to prove that he or she is not yet married in another jurisdiction. So in terms of our Marriages Act, the requirement of a single union between two people would then have to be substantiated. And this is often referred to as a letter of non-impediment, which is then obtained from the person's country of origin. This is usually, depending on the jurisdiction, a fairly long process. So couples are urged to get the ball rolling as it goes as soon as possible in order to avoid any unforeseen delays in the process. When it comes to the antenuptial contract requirement, our legal system has not yet evolved beyond the common law principle of the law of the husband being the keyword, domicile, meaning your antenuptial contract can only be binding in a South African context if your intention is to make this your home after your global trotting. This is where you come back to, and this is what you consider to be home or home base, if as it were. However, the factor that we consider is the intent of, unfortunately, only one of the two parties, and currently still in our system related to the law of the husband's domicile. So this is probably something that we would see challenged in the near future, but that's how it stands for the moment.
Okay, so besides visas and the proof that neither of you are married in other countries, is there anything else that you'd need when you apply at Home Affairs?
So that would be the requirements from a Home Affairs perspective.
Okay. But
from a legal perspective, the intent has to be recorded within the antenuptial contract that South Africa will be the jurisdiction of choice when it comes to the legal system chosen.
Okay. Now, would you need to prove that your marriage is not one of convenience? And if so, how would you go about doing that?
So, of course, this is more a consideration for so I think let me take a step back. We need to obviously draw a distinction between a visa requirement, where the relationship becomes the basis on which the foreign national would seek a visa or a residency permit within the South African context. And there it becomes relevant to prove the legitimacy of the relationship. Now, we would hope that if one goes the route of not just cohabiting and recording that by way of an agreement, but actually contracting the contract of marriage, that the marriage officer would usually make some inquiries, see how long the couple have been together, get a bit of history, and mostly we don't see this in the actual documents, but usually these are conversations to be had in that context. If it's only a cohabitative arrangement, then the actual cohabitation agreement needs to speak to the duration and actually attest to the fact that this is a legitimate, exclusive romantic relationship.
If you've just tuned in, we are talking about foreign and local people getting married and what legal complications that brings in today's Legal Talk segment. And on the line is Nicolene Schoeman-Louw, who is an attorney and the managing director of SchoemanLaw Inc. And if you have a question for Nicolene, you are most welcome to send it in to us now. You can send it on the WhatsApp line on 072 567 1567 or even give us a call 021 446 0567. I believe we do have a listener that's asked a question on WhatsApp now.
How does this husband thing work with same union couples?
Nicolene, did you get that?
Yes, I got that. That is a very good question, because under the Civil Unions Act, which makes provision for the execution of anti-nuptial contracts within a same-sex union, we have not seen the law evolving beyond that. So for the moment, what most practitioners are doing is that we are actually recording that there's an agreement between both parties that both elect the domicile of South Africa to govern or to be the locality that determines the legal system pertaining to the regulation of their marriage. So because we have this provision that hasn't evolved alongside the legislative evolution, that's technically what we are doing at the moment. But of course, as with taking surnames, which is traditionally also something that a woman would do in a heterosexual union or in a heterosexual marriage, even that has been challenged just a few weeks ago in the High Court of Bloemfontein, and that is actually being referred to the Constitutional Court. So we've got a few bits and pieces that has to be challenged and has to evolve alongside the developments that we've seen. So for the moment, that's unfortunately the only solution that we can offer.
Now, Nicolene, let's take a look at South Africans that may travel abroad and fall in love and marry a foreigner. How do they then register that marriage in South Africa?
So it depends on the intent of the couple, to be honest. If the South African citizen is of the intent to move abroad to where the spouse is a resident and domiciled, South Africa wouldn't have jurisdiction in terms of being the applicable legal regime to the marriage. Of course, the couple can still register an anti-nuptial contract here, but if the intent to permanently settle here and to have this as your domicile is absent at the outset of the marriage, it would probably be more advisable for the South African, the couple as a whole, but for the South Africans specifically, to take some legal advice in the jurisdiction where they intend to settle and to then register their marriage over there, as well as their anti-nuptial or post-nuptial or pre-nuptial agreement, depending on the jurisdiction we are referring to. If one wants to return to South Africa later in life, naturally you would have the marriage recognized over here, maybe specifically when you are seeking to acquire property or transfer an existing property over here. But it really depends on your aspirations and your objectives as a couple and where you ultimately want to settle down.
Okay, that's useful to know. Now let's go from there to what happens when the marriage dissolves for some reason. So you've been overseas and you've married a foreigner, you've registered it in South Africa because your ultimate goal is potentially to live here or buy property here, and then the marriage ends. What then?
Well, if the marriage ends and your intent was to have South African law apply to the consequences of your marriage, you've executed a South African anti-nuptial contract in the normal course, ticking all the right boxes. And let's say you're in a situation where you are abroad and the marriage comes to an end. Then the court where you are stationed would apply South African legal principles and South African law in order to dissolve your marriage. Of course, if it happens over here, even if you've stayed abroad for some time, it will then follow the same course. But ultimately, the principles that we know and apply here would be applied even if it's in a foreign court.
Okay, good to know. Now, if you've got a question for Nicolene Schoeman-Louw, you've got just a couple of minutes left to ask about being any legal issues that you may be having within a foreign and local marriage scenario. Nicolene, what happens if your marriage certificate is not in one of South Africa's official languages and needs to be translated? How does that process work?
Well, we usually see this in the instance where the couple wishes to relocate abroad, or if you've had a destination wedding as a South African, you've executed your anti-nuptial contract over here and you've returned here, but your marriage certificate is maybe issued in a foreign jurisdiction. Of course, we would need to ensure that the provisions of the Marriages Act is complied with in order for it to be an official marriage in terms of our legal system. Therefore, it's usually customary for South Africans to have a legal ceremony, which is binding and ticks all the right boxes over here, and then the destination wedding becomes ceremonial but non-legal in value only.
Okay.
If that certificate, however, is what one would want to rely upon and it is in a foreign language, there's usually a network of what we call sworn translators who would then translate it into English or at least one of the official languages of South Africa. And that is then usually attested to by a notary public to ensure the authenticity of the process. And that would then be sent to the authorities locally. However, it's really important for couples, if you are planning that destination wedding and you're a South African, rather make sure that you've got a South African ceremony that ticks all the boxes under the relevant legislation, and have your destination wedding and have it as a ceremony only, just to be on the safe side.
Got you. Unfortunately, we're out of time, so that we'll have to leave it there. But thank you, Nicolene, for joining us this week and for all that very, very useful information. And I think my big takeaway from that conversation was if you are planning to marry a foreigner, you need to start the process early. There are a lot of boxes that you need to tick, and so you can't just start planning sort of a week or two before the wedding. That was Nicolene Schoeman-Louw, attorney and managing director of SchoemanLaw Inc.